Humanity walked away from the peace talks. The Galactic Council realized its doom. I did not sit down when they told me to. That was how it started. Not with a speech, not with a grand declaration, not with soldiers or ships or any of the things the Galactic Council expected from us. It started with a chair I refused to pull out, in a room that smelled of recycled air and old power, while 9 alien species watched me like I was an animal that had somehow wandered into their dining hall. My name is Mara Voss. I was 44 years old, Fleet Admiral of United Earth Command, and for reasons that still make me want to laugh and cry at the same time, I was also humanity's chief delegate to the Galactic Peace Summit. The summit that was supposed to end 11 years of war between Earth and the Vreth Dominion. The summit that was, I would discover in the next 4 hours, never actually meant to be a negotiation at all. The station was called Conclave Prime. It had been built by the Ithori 3 centuries ago, and everything about it was designed to remind you of your place. The corridors were tall enough to make a human feel like a child walking through a cathedral. The council chamber itself sat at the center of the station like the heart of something ancient and certain of its own importance. The ceiling was at least 60 meters high. The council table was a circle of dark mineral that caught the light from a dozen different suns through the transparent walls. 9 delegations sat at that table. We were the 10th. Our shuttle had docked 2 hours earlier. My aide, a sharp young man named Colin Okafor, had briefed me on the way in. He had a habit of reading aloud from his notes without looking up, which I had come to find oddly comforting. His voice was steady even when the information was not. The Vreth are already seated, he said, not looking up. The Ithori Elder, Councillor Vey, will be presiding. The Shen Coalition has requested that translation delays be limited to 30 seconds per statement. The Dorati are apparently unhappy about the seating arrangement. The Dorati are always unhappy about something, I said. Yes, Admiral. A pause. The preliminary draft of the terms has been loaded to your tablet. I picked up the tablet. I read the first page. Then I read it again. I did not read the second page for a long time. When I finally set the tablet down, Colin was watching me with that careful expression young people wear when they suspect bad news but have not yet been told what it is. Who drafted these terms? I asked. The Council's Arbitration Committee. When? He checked his notes. The draft was finalized approximately 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks ago. The summit had been announced 6 weeks ago. The invitation to humanity had arrived 5 weeks ago. I did the mathematics in my head and felt something settle in my chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a cold lake. We had been invited to a summit where the outcome had already been written before the invitations were sent. I did not say anything else for the rest of the approach. I sat with the tablet on my knee and looked out at Conclave Prime growing larger through the shuttle window, and I thought about my grandmother. She had been a school teacher in a small town in northern Germany. She used to say that the most dangerous moment in any argument was not when someone raised their voice. It was when someone else in the room decided that your silence meant consent. Mara, she told me once, when I was about 9 years old and had been pushed around by a bigger kid at school, there is a difference between being patient and being invisible. Do not let anyone confuse the two. I had not thought about that in years. I thought about it for the entire walk from the docking bay to the council chamber. The chamber itself was already full when we entered. The Vreth delegation sat directly across from our assigned seats, 12 of them in gray formal attire, their narrow heads tilted slightly forward in what I had learned was their posture of formal attention. They were taller than us by almost half a meter. They had 4 arms and eyes that sat wide on their faces, and they had been at war with humanity for 11 years, and in that moment, looking at them across that enormous circular table, I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt sorry for them. Because they looked as uncomfortable as we did. They did not look like a victorious species arriving to collect their prize. They looked like people who had been called into a headmaster's office and were not entirely sure what they had done wrong. I filed that thought away carefully. Councillor Vey opened the session. The Ithori were the oldest species at the table, and Vey looked every part of it, his skin a deep gray blue, his eyes filmed with the pale color of great age. His voice was translated into smooth, unhurried English through the earpiece I wore. He spoke for 12 minutes about the importance of peace, the cost of conflict, the responsibility of advanced civilizations to find resolution without further loss. It was, I will admit, beautifully said. Then the terms were presented. A display screen behind Vey lit up with the full document, 73 clauses, and a council secretary began reading them aloud. Colin sat to my right with his tablet open, making small marks as each clause was read. I watched his face. He was good at keeping his expression neutral. By clause 9, a faint line had appeared between his eyebrows. By clause 17, his pen had stopped moving entirely. The terms required humanity to surrender 4 colony systems. Not negotiate their status. Surrender them, fully and permanently, to neutral council administration, which in practice meant they would never return to human governance. The terms also required Earth to accept a permanent council observer mission. Not a diplomatic presence. An observer mission with full access to military installations, communication networks, and governmental records. For an indefinite period. The terms further required humanity to submit to a weapons reduction schedule over 20 years, monitored by the Council, with penalties for non-compliance that included trade suspension and travel restrictions. The Vreth were required to withdraw from 2 contested sectors. I read that last part 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly. The war had lasted 11 years. Humanity had lost over 200,000 people. We had fought the Vreth to a hard, costly, grinding standstill across 4 star systems, and in doing so had demonstrated to the galaxy that we were not a species that folded when things became difficult. And now the Council, the supposedly neutral arbiter, was asking us to give up 4 systems in exchange for the Vreth pulling back from 2. I looked at Councillor Vey. He was watching me with the calm attention of someone who had done this many times before and expected a particular outcome. He was already leaning slightly forward in his chair, ready to move to the next procedural step, the signing of the agreement in principle before detailed amendments were discussed. He thought I was about to sit down and pick up a pen. I thought about my grandmother again. I stood up. The sound in the chamber did not change immediately. It took about 2 seconds for people to realize what was happening, that I was not standing to ask a procedural question, that I was not adjusting my translation earpiece. The Ithori secretary stopped reading mid-sentence. Around the table, 12 alien species shifted and tilted and turned their various forms of attention toward me. I buttoned the top button of my uniform jacket. It was a small gesture. I do not know exactly why I did it. It felt like the right thing to do when you are about to say something that cannot be taken back. Humanity does not accept these terms. 6 words. Clear, simple, grammatically correct English. I was proud of how steady my voice was. Councillor Vey blinked slowly. Admiral Voss, the forum for amendment proposals will open in the 3rd session. If you have specific concerns regarding individual clauses. I do not have concerns regarding individual clauses, I said. I have concerns regarding all 73 of them. This document was written before we were invited here. It is not a treaty. It is a sentence. And humanity did not come to Conclave Prime to be sentenced. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear Colin exhale very slowly beside me. I looked once around the table. The Vreth delegation had gone very still. One of them, the admiral on their side whose name I had been briefed on, Dren, was watching me with an expression I could not fully read but that did not look like anger. I picked up my briefing folder. I nodded once to Councillor Vey, because whatever I thought of the proceedings, he was old and I had been raised with manners. Then I walked out. Colin fell into step beside me 2 seconds later. We did not run. We walked at the same pace we had walked in, steady and unhurried, through the great tall corridors of Conclave Prime, past the guards who did not stop us because nothing in their protocols covered this particular situation, through the docking bay, and back onto our shuttle. The door sealed behind us. Colin sat down across from me and put his tablet on his knee and looked at me for a long moment. Well, he said finally. Yes, I said. Do you want me to contact Earth Command? Give me 5 minutes first. I sat back in my seat and looked out the window at the station. Somewhere in there, in that chamber with the 60-meter ceiling and the table made of dark mineral, 9 alien civilizations were staring at the door I had walked through, trying to understand what had just happened. I was trying to understand it myself. But beneath the uncertainty, beneath the knowledge that I had just done something that had never been done in the history of the Galactic Council, there was something else. Something quiet and solid. I was not afraid. I was not afraid, and that, I would later understand, was the beginning of everything. Part 2. We were 11 minutes out from Conclave Prime when the first communication came in. It was not from the Council. It was from our own side, a tightly encrypted message from Admiral Grant Pierce back at Earth Command, time-stamped 17 minutes before I had walked out of the chamber. He had been watching the proceedings through the relay feed. He had seen the terms go up on the display. The message was 4 sentences long, and I will summarize it by saying that Grant was not a man who used strong language often, and he used it 3 times in those 4 sentences. He was not angry at me. He was angry at the terms. That mattered. I sat in the shuttle with Colin across from me and the stars sliding past the window, and I read Grant's message 3 times, and each time I felt more certain that I had done the right thing. Not because Grant agreed with me. Because even a man sitting 400 light-years away, watching a video feed with a 17-minute delay, had looked at those terms and felt the same thing I had felt. We had not been invited to a negotiation. We had been invited to a ceremony. The second communication came in 40 minutes later. This one was from the Council. Specifically, it was from a junior Ithori diplomatic aide, a formal notification that the session had been suspended pending the return of the human delegation, and that the Council wished to convey its hope that the recess would allow for a productive reassessment of humanity's position. It was politely worded. It was also, if you read it correctly, very confident. The word recess implied that the session would resume. The phrase productive reassessment implied that the expected product of that reassessment was humanity coming back to the table. They thought we had walked out to make a point. They did not yet understand that we had walked out to leave. I dictated a reply. Simple, 3 sentences. I thanked the Council for the notification. I confirmed that humanity's position was clear and did not require a recess to reassess. I wished the remaining delegations a productive session. Colin read it back to me. He paused at the last sentence. Do you want to keep the bit about wishing them a productive session? Yes. It's going to confuse them. That's why I'm keeping it. He sent it. We arrived back at the UEC forward station, a smaller installation on the edge of the neutral zone, about 3 hours later. The station commander, a practical woman named Helen Briggs, met us at the docking bay with a look on her face that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. Earth is asking for a full briefing, she said. I know. The Council has already sent 2 follow-up communications. I know that too. Admiral Pierce has also asked me to convey, and I am quoting directly here, that he would very much appreciate a conversation at your earliest convenience, and if your earliest convenience could be in the next 15 minutes, that would be ideal. I almost smiled. Tell Grant I'll call him in 20. I need coffee first. Helen looked at Colin. Colin looked at Helen. They had that brief wordless exchange that people who work in logistics share when the person they are responsible for is doing something that is going to create a large amount of work. I went and got coffee. The briefing with Grant Pierce lasted 2 hours. He was a broad man with gray in his hair and the kind of patience that comes from spending 30 years managing things that did not go according to plan. He listened to my full account without interrupting more than twice. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. They drafted the terms 8 weeks ago, he said. Yes. Before the invitation was sent. Yes. Another pause. And the Vreth were only required to withdraw from 2 sectors. In exchange for us surrendering 4 full systems, accepting an indefinite observer mission, and submitting to a weapons reduction schedule. Grant rubbed his jaw. I had seen him do that before, always when he was working through something he did not want to say out loud. The Council is going to call it a negotiating position. They'll say it was a starting point. 73 clauses, I said. Starting points do not have 73 clauses. You don't write a draft that detailed for something you expect to revise heavily. You write that for something you expect to be signed. He looked at me steadily. You understand what walking out means. It means we either hold our position or we eventually go back and take a worse deal, yes. Not worse for us, he said. Worse for Earth. For the colonies. For the people who have been fighting this war for 11 years. I know, Grant. I'm not disagreeing with you, Mara. His voice was quiet. I just want to make sure you have looked at all of it. I had looked at all of it. I had looked at it on the shuttle, and before the shuttle, and in the 3 sleepless nights before the summit when I had read every analysis our diplomatic corps had produced. I had looked at what surrender of those 4 systems would mean for the 80,000 people who lived in them. I had looked at what a Council observer mission with unlimited access would mean for our military planning. I had looked at the weapons reduction schedule and run the numbers, and the numbers said that in 20 years, under those terms, humanity would be a species with the legal status of a protected ward and the defensive capability of a minor trade guild. I have looked at all of it, I said. Grant nodded slowly. Then we hold. We hold. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different tone, he said, the Council sent 3 envoys to our communications relay before your shuttle even docked. They assumed you would answer. We didn't answer. No. Something shifted slightly in his expression. That apparently created a considerable amount of confusion at Conclave Prime. Good. He almost smiled. The Shin representative reportedly asked whether humanity had experienced a system failure. And our relay operator, apparently acting on her own initiative, sent back a single-word reply. What word? No. I did set my coffee down at that point and I did, actually, laugh. It was the first time I had laughed in what felt like a very long time. The relay operator's name was Diane Fuller. She was 23 years old, from a town called Whitby on the English coast, and she had joined UEC Communications Division 2 years earlier. She had no diplomatic training and no authority to reply to Council communications. She had heard the question, looked at the situation, and replied with the most accurate word available. She was, I later learned, terrified that she was going to be disciplined for it. I put her in for a commendation instead. The next 36 hours were a controlled form of organized activity that I will not call chaos because the people involved were too professional for that word, but which certainly had chaos's energy. Earth's parliament was in emergency session. Our 3 ambassador-level diplomats were recalled from various postings for briefings. The UEC Public Communications Office was managing a news environment that ranged from full support to profound alarm, often in the same publication. 3 things happened during those 36 hours that I want to describe precisely, because each one mattered. The first was that the Vreth Dominion recalled their border patrol fleets from 3 contested sectors. Not all their ships, not a full withdrawal, but a quiet, deliberate repositioning of forces away from the most active engagement zones. Our intelligence teams noticed within hours. No explanation was given. No communication accompanied the movement. They simply moved their ships back, in 3 sectors, and went quiet. The second thing was that a member of the Shin Coalition, one of the 9 Council species, sent a private message to our embassy at Neutral Station Corda 7. The message was addressed not to our ambassador but to our trade liaison, a man named Paul Adler, who had been running quiet commercial negotiations with a Shin subsidiary for the better part of a year. The message was brief. It asked, in carefully indirect language, whether humanity's current diplomatic posture would affect ongoing discussions about mineral exchange agreements. The question itself was routine. The fact that it was sent at all, within 24 hours of our walkout, was not routine at all. Paul flagged it immediately. I read his report and felt something shift in my understanding of what was happening. The Council had presented itself as a unified body speaking with a single voice. But a unified body does not send quiet private inquiries within 24 hours of a confrontation. A unified body trusts that the confrontation will resolve itself. Only a body with fractures sends private inquiries. Only a body that is not entirely sure of its own solidarity starts looking for back channels before the dust has settled. The third thing was the message from Councillor Vey. It came directly to my personal communication channel, not through official Council channels, not through diplomatic intermediaries. It was voice only, no visual, and it was brief. In English, which the Ithori rarely used directly, preferring the translation matrix. His voice was slow and very old and entirely calm. Admiral Voss, he said. I have studied humanity for 60 of your years. I have read your histories, your literature, your strategic records. I believed I understood your people reasonably well. I am writing to tell you that I appear to have been mistaken. A pause. I would like to understand the nature of my error. When you are prepared to speak, I hope you will contact me. Not as delegations. As individuals. He ended the message there. I played it twice. Then I sat in the quiet of my temporary office on Helen Briggs's station and looked at the wall for a while. 60 years of studying us, and he had still been surprised. I thought about what that meant. Not about Counselor Vey specifically, but about the shape of the situation we were in. The Council had looked at humanity and seen what every other species had seen when presented with the isolation protocol or the compliance framework or whatever instrument of pressure was being applied. They had seen a species that would calculate the cost, find the cost too high, and step back into line. They had not accounted for the possibility that we would look at the cost, agree that it was very high, and decide that the alternative cost was higher. They had not accounted for the fact that we had a word, a short and simple word, that we were not using as a negotiating tactic. We were using it because we meant it. I drafted a reply to Counselor Vey. I told him I would speak with him, as individuals, when we had something worth saying to each other. I told him that time might come sooner than he expected. Then I called Grant Pierce and told him to start making preparations. Not for a return to the summit. For a very different kind of conversation. Part 3. Nobody slept much in those 30 days. That was not a complaint. Humans, in my experience, do not actually mind not sleeping when the work feels important enough. Something in us is built for sustained effort under pressure, built for the long push, the night shift, the extra hour and then the hour after that. Other species have told me that this unsettles them. The Shen work in careful, measured cycles. The Ithori have cultural prohibitions against what they call forced urgency. The Dorati require rest intervals that are built into their biology. We stayed up and we kept working. While the Galactic Council sat at Conclave Prime and waited for humanity to come to its senses, humanity was spending 30 days doing what it had always done best under pressure. We were building. I want to be specific, because the word building is easy to say and hard to truly visualize at the scale we were operating. The shipyards at Callisto had been running 2 shifts a day since the war began. We moved them to 3. Not by ordering extra construction, but by moving the people who were already there, offering voluntary extended rotations, and finding that the sign-up list filled within 48 hours. I went to Callisto on day 4 to see it myself. Helen Briggs came with me because she insisted, and because she had good instincts about when she needed to be somewhere in person. The yard stretched for 40 kilometers along the Callisto surface, a long spine of scaffolding and welding light and the bright blue flash of ion assembly. You could feel it through your boots, even through the station flooring, a faint vibration like something enormous breathing. Workers in pressure suits moved along the structures in organized streams, and above them, half-assembled hulls hung in the dark like the ribs of creatures not yet born. I stood at the observation window and watched it for a long time. A young engineer came and stood nearby, not introducing himself, just watching the same thing I was watching. After a moment he said, quietly, "They're asking us to work harder and we're doing it. Nobody told us why, officially. We just know." I looked at him. He was maybe 25, dark-haired, a UEC technical badge on his sleeve. "What's your name?" "Owen Clark." "Do you want to know why, Owen?" He thought about it. "Not officially. I think we already know. We're not going back to accept those terms." "No," I said. "We are not." He nodded once, the way people nod when they have had a suspicion confirmed rather than a surprise delivered. Then he went back to work. That was Callisto. Across the human sphere, the same thing was happening in different forms. Logistics chains that had been running at 80% efficiency were tightened to 95. Reserve fleets that had been in maintenance status were quietly reactivated and moved to staging positions. Not aggressively. Not in a way that would read on long-range sensors as a mobilization. Just moved, checked, supplied, and made ready. On day 7, I gave a briefing to the full UEC Strategic Committee. 22 people in a room that smelled of coffee and recycled air, and I laid out where we stood. I told them that we were in a position that had no precedent in Council history, that the Council's tools of pressure depended on a species wanting the things the Council could withhold, and that humanity's greatest advantage in this situation was the same thing that had always been both our greatest advantage and our most frustrating quality. We were uncomfortable with being told what to do. One of the committee members, a quiet man named Arthur Kane who ran strategic planning, asked the question that was sitting in everyone's mind. How long can we hold before the economic pressure becomes critical? 14 months at current reserves, if full sanctions are applied. And if we open alternative trade relationships? Longer. Possibly indefinite. Alternative trade with whom? Someone asked from the far end of the table. I let that sit for exactly 2 seconds, the way you let a question breathe when you want people to arrive at the answer themselves rather than have it handed to them. Arthur Kane got there first. He was a quick man. The Vreth, he said. Among others, I said. The room was quiet in a particular way. Not uncertain quiet. Thinking quiet. Here is what our intelligence picture showed on day 12 of the 30-day period. The council was not unified. I had suspected this from Vey's private message and from the Shintrade inquiry, but by day 12 we had firmer information. 3 of the 9 council species wanted to move immediately to the full isolation protocol, which would formally prohibit any other species from trading with or sheltering humanity. 4 species wanted to wait, believing that economic pressure alone would produce compliance within 60 days. 2 species had, in various quiet ways, indicated openness to bilateral arrangements that did not involve the council's existing framework. 2 out of 9. That was not a rounding error. That was a fracture. And the Vreth were not at that table at all. The Vreth had not attended a council session since our walkout. This had been noted in the public council record as a procedural absence, attributed to logistical scheduling. Our intelligence service, which had gotten considerably better over 11 years of fighting the Vreth, read it differently. The Vreth were not attending because they were uncertain whose side they wanted to be on when the lines were drawn more clearly. That was why, on day 14, when I received a private communication from a Vreth source, I was not entirely surprised. The source identified himself as Fleet Commander Dren Akar, which I recognized immediately because Dren Akar was the flag officer who had commanded the Vreth fleet at the Battle of Cydonia, 3 years earlier. He had fought us for 19 days across an asteroid field that made precise navigation nearly impossible, and he had done it with tactical intelligence and, I noted at the time, a complete absence of unnecessary cruelty. When it became clear that neither side could achieve a decisive victory, he had pulled his fleet back in good order rather than continuing an engagement that was costing both sides heavily for no strategic gain. I had respected that decision from the first time I read the after-action report. His message was not encrypted through any official Vreth channel. It came through a commercial relay, flagged as standard trade inquiry correspondence, and it was brief. He did not use coded language. He wrote in direct, plain terms, which I found I liked. He said, "Admiral Voss, I watched you stand up and walk out of the council chamber. I have thought about little else since. My people have a saying that does not translate well, but the nearest version is this: 2 animals trapped in the same cage are not each other's enemy. I would like to speak with you. Not as flag officers. As people who have been fighting someone else's war. Someone else's war." I read that phrase 4 times. Then I called Colin Okafor into my office and told him to clear my schedule for the next morning. The conversation with Dren Akar took place through a secure relay, and it lasted 6 hours. It was the longest and most important conversation I had that entire year, possibly in my career. I am not going to recount all of it here, because some of it remains confidential, and because much of it was the kind of careful, slow establishment of trust that does not translate well into brief summary. We spent the first hour simply confirming that the other person was speaking honestly. We spent the second hour on history. The history mattered. The Vreth Dominion and humanity had gone to war 11 years earlier over the Cydonia Belt, a resource-rich zone of space that sat between our respective expansion frontiers. The official account, on both sides, was that the other had initiated hostilities. I had grown up with the human version. Dren had grown up with the Vreth version. We laid them side by side, and what emerged was not a clear picture of who had fired first, but a very clear picture of how the situation had been framed, on both sides, by entities that had an interest in keeping us fighting. Council Intelligence Services. Third-party communication brokers. Diplomatic advisors with connections to Council member species. They told us you were planning to claim the entire belt, Dren said. That you had a secret fleet assembly already underway. They told us you had already laid claim markers on 14 systems inside our declared expansion zone, I said. With a signed council agreement to back the claims. A pause. A long one. Neither of those things was true, he said. No, I said. Neither of those things was true. By the time that conversation ended, late on day 14, we had not reached any formal agreement. We were not in a position to reach formal agreements yet. But we had reached something that was in some ways more important. We had reached a shared understanding of what had actually happened, and why, and who had benefited from it. The Council had benefited. A humanity and Vreth Dominion that were fighting each other were two problems contained in one location. Two expanding species who had stopped fighting and started comparing notes were something else entirely. That something else is what the Council had apparently spent the better part of 2 decades trying to prevent. Over the next 16 days, the quiet communication between myself and Dren Akar continued. It was cautious. It was slow. It involved a great deal of checking and rechecking of information on both sides. But it was also, underneath all the caution, something that surprised me. It was easy. Not the logistics of it. Not the security concerns or the translation challenges or the political sensitivity on both sides. Those were all genuinely difficult. What I mean is that the act of talking to Dren Akar, once we had established that we were both approaching the conversation honestly, was surprisingly easy. He thought in ways I recognized. He worried about the same things I worried about. He had a dry wit that came through even in translation. He had a family, children, a home on the Vreth homeworld that he had not seen in 4 years because the war had kept him posted to the frontier. We were not the same. But we were not nearly as different as 11 years of conflict had taught us to believe. On day 28, Dren and I had a final, longer call. At the end of it, he asked me a question. If we were to propose a ceasefire, not through the Council, directly between our governments, do you believe humanity would consider it? I thought about Grant Pierce, and Arthur Kane, and Owen Clark at the shipyard window, and Diane Fuller and her single-word reply. I believe humanity would consider it very seriously, I said. And the Council? The Council, I said carefully, would not be invited to that conversation. Another pause. Then, in a tone I had not heard from him before, something quieter and more personal, we have a word in the old Vreth dialects. It is used for a specific moment. The moment when two people, who have been told they are enemies, realize they have been lied to. We do not have a word for what comes after that moment. We might have something, I said. We would have to find the right translation. On day 30, I drafted a full briefing for Earth's Parliament. I included everything. The Council's fractures. The Vreth communication. The progress at Callisto. The trade inquiries from the Shen coalition member. The shape of what was possible. Parliament read it overnight. The next morning, they sent back their answer in 7 words. Hold the position. You have our backing. And so we moved to the next phase. Part 4. The Council's deadline arrived on a Tuesday. I remember that detail because Grant Pierce mentioned it when he called, early that morning before the formal notification came through. He had been awake since 4, which was not unusual for him. He said, "It's Tuesday. The Council is going to send the ultimatum today." "I know," I said. 72 hours to return to the table or they trigger the isolation protocol. "I know that too." "How are we feeling about Tuesday?" he said. "Cautiously prepared," I said. He made a short sound that was approximately a laugh. "I'll take it." The formal notification came through official Council channels at 9 in the morning, precisely as the Council's internal session records would later confirm had been agreed upon the previous evening. The isolation decree was the Council's most serious instrument. In 800 years of history, it had been invoked twice. The first time, against a species called the Pulhari who had refused a trade arbitration ruling, it had worked within 31 hours. The second time, against a Dorothy faction that had attempted a unilateral expansion claim, it had worked within 48 hours. They expected the same result with us. Our Public Affairs Office had been preparing for this moment for 2 weeks. Not preparing a responsive alarm or a counter-ultimatum or a diplomatic appeal. Preparing something else entirely. At 11 that morning, we released a document. It was 47 pages long. It had been written by a team of 8 people, 4 of whom were lawyers, 2 of whom were historians, 1 of whom was a retired Council protocol officer who had come to work for UEC Intelligence 3 years earlier after a disagreement with his former employers about the accuracy of certain Council records. The document was titled, An Analysis of the Galactic Council Isolation Decree in the Context of the Council's Founding Charter, Articles 1 through 19, with reference to precedent cases. It was not exciting reading, on its surface. But what it contained was, in practical terms, a precise and fully documented argument that the isolation protocol, as applied to humanity's current situation, violated 6 specific articles of the Council's own founding charter. It cited the original Ithori text. It cited the Council's own precedent rulings from the past 4 centuries. It cited 17 cases in which the Council had ruled that economic isolation could not be used as coercive pressure in active diplomatic disputes without a prior finding of fault by an independent arbitration panel. No independent arbitration panel had ever reviewed our case. No finding of fault had ever been issued. We were not refusing the Council's terms because we were aggressive or expansionist or resistant to peace. We were refusing them because we had read the Council's own rules more carefully than the Council apparently had, and we were now, very politely, asking them to follow those rules. And we were filing 340 injunctions in the Council's own legal tribunal to ensure they did. The legal team had a name for this approach. They called it systematic accountability. I called it using the lock to open the door that the lock was supposed to keep closed. Either way, it worked on the same principle. The Council's power rested on the assumption that its rules were instruments of control. What no one had apparently tried before was treating those rules as instruments of protection. The Council's legal division was, according to the intelligence reports we received over the next 72 hours, in a state of organized disorder. 340 injunctions required responses. Each response required review of the relevant charter article, the relevant precedent cases, and the relevant procedural history. The Council's tribunal had a staff of roughly 60 legal professionals. They were accustomed to handling, at most, a dozen significant filings in any given month. We gave them 340 in one morning. The tribunal chair, a Shan jurist named Councillor Preth, apparently requested a procedural delay of 30 days before any response could be issued. This was, under the Council's own tribunal rules, completely standard. It was also, under the same rules, something that any filing party could contest. We contested it. Our legal team requested that all 340 injunctions be reviewed under the emergency provisions of the Charter, which allowed for expedited hearings when the subject matter involved active diplomatic processes. The emergency provisions were rarely used. They had been written 400 years ago for exactly this kind of situation, and they meant that the tribunal could not simply postpone our filings. They had to address them. Councillor Preth, according to a source within the Council's administrative structure who had become quietly sympathetic to the general concept of procedural fairness, reportedly used language that day that had never previously appeared in an official Council document. Meanwhile, on day 2 of the 72-hour window, something else happened that I had been waiting for and had not been entirely certain would occur when it did. The Human Breath Bilateral Ceasefire Compact was signed. It happened aboard a neutral relay station, in a room with no ceremonial decorations because neither side had thought to bring any, which Dren Akar later said he found fitting. He was present in person. I was present by high-fidelity projection because we had agreed it was better, at this stage, not to have me physically absent from UEC territory. The compact was 7 pages long, drafted in both English and Vreth, and its terms were straightforward. An immediate cessation of active engagements across all contested sectors. A mutual withdrawal to pre-conflict holding positions. An exchange of any detained personnel within 30 days. And a commitment to begin formal peace negotiations within 60 days, conducted bilaterally, without Council involvement. No Council involvement. That was in the text, explicitly, not as an insult but as a statement of fact. The two parties to the conflict had reached their own agreement. The Council had not been asked to broker it, endorse it, or oversee it. We released the text publicly 90 minutes after signing. The response was immediate, enormous, and very satisfying to watch. 3 Council member species issued statements within 4 hours. 2 of the statements expressed concern about the precedent being set. One expressed what could only be described as cautious admiration, which it tried to wrap in neutral diplomatic language but did not entirely succeed. Within 6 hours, a small species called the Thuan, who were not Council members and had been living under a Council-administered trade restriction for 11 years following a boundary dispute, sent our embassy a message asking if they could learn more about the new compact and its membership structure. Within 12 hours, 2 other species had sent similar inquiries. By the time the Council's 72-hour deadline expired, we had 7 formal membership inquiries for an organization that had not formally existed 4 days earlier. I was in my office when Colin Okafor came in to tell me about the 7th inquiry. He had a particular expression on his face that I had come to recognize over the previous weeks, the expression of someone who is watching something unfold that they had believed in theoretically but had not quite expected to see actually happening. 7, he said. 7, I confirmed. The Council's deadline expired 40 minutes ago. I know. They haven't triggered the isolation protocol. No, I said. They haven't. I had expected this. Not because I had been certain they would hold back, but because I had understood what the math looked like from their side. Triggering the isolation protocol required a full council vote. A full council vote required all 9 member species to agree. 3 species had already been sending quiet signals in our direction. 3 species abstaining from a vote was not a majority, but it was enough to delay, to request procedural review, to trigger the exact kind of internal process that the Council's rules required when there was not consensus. The Council was discovering what happened when the machinery it had built to govern others was turned toward governing itself. In the midst of all of this, Councillor Vey called me again. This time he used the official channel and he requested a video session, not a voice message. I accepted. He appeared on my screen looking, I thought, somewhat older than he had at the summit, which was probably a function of what his last 30-odd days had looked like. He said, without preamble, "You filed 340 injunctions." 342, I said. 2 additional ones came through on day 1 after our team found relevant precedent in the original charter annotations. He was quiet for a moment. The injunctions are technically valid. I know. Many of them reference provisions that have not been invoked in centuries. We found them useful. Another pause. Where did you find the legal team capable of doing this in 12 days? I considered how much to say. Humans have a great many lawyers, I said. We have always had a great many lawyers. It is, historically speaking, something of a cultural feature. He looked at me for a long moment with those pale filmed eyes. I owe you an honest statement. All right. When I presided over the summit session and read the terms, I expected compliance. I have presided over 47 formal compliance sessions in my career. Every species, when shown the full weight of the Council's instruments, has complied. Every species until us. Yes. He said it simply, without embarrassment, which I respected. I did not believe you would walk out. I believed it was a posture. When you did not return, I believed the economics would bring you back. When you filed the injunctions, I began to revise my understanding of your species quite significantly. What revised it most? I asked, genuinely curious. He thought for a moment. The lawyer, he said. Not the fleet movements, not the ceasefire, not the membership inquiries. There was a line in the 7th injunction. It cited an Ithori ruling from 260 years ago, made by a panel that included my own great predecessor, ruling in favor of a species called the Pulhari in a boundary case. The ruling said, and I quote from your filing, that economic coercion in the absence of due process was, in the Council's own language, a corruption of the order we were built to protect. A pause. My own people wrote those words. We had apparently forgotten them. We remembered them for you, I said. He looked at me, and something in his expression shifted in a way that I could not fully read but that felt, unexpectedly, like respect. What do you want, Admiral Voss? He asked. Not as a diplomatic question. As a real one. I told him the truth. We want a seat at a table we helped build. We want the Vreth to have the same. We want the species that have been living under Council restrictions for border disputes and trade disagreements and all the other small reasons powerful entities find to keep smaller ones in line, we want them to have a legitimate alternative. We don't want to destroy the Council. We want to prove it doesn't have to work the way it has been working. He was quiet for a long time. That is a very ambitious thing to want, he said finally. We're a very ambitious species, I said. He ended the call there. But before he closed the connection, he paused, and in a tone so quiet I almost missed it, he said, I am beginning to think you may achieve it. I sat with that for a while. Outside my window, in the deep dark between stars, the Callisto yards were still running 3 shifts. 7 species had asked about the compact. 342 injunctions sat in the Council's legal tribunal like careful stones dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. And somewhere in the neutral zone, Dren Akar was standing down the border fleets and starting the long process of explaining to his people that the war they had been fighting was one they had been guided into, and that the enemy they had been fighting was not, in the final accounting, their enemy at all. I went back to work. Part 5. A year is not a long time in the history of a civilization. I know this because I have read enough history to understand that the things which feel enormous in the moment, the shifts and turns that seem like they are remaking everything at once, usually take longer to become real than they feel like they should. Revolutions that people describe as happening overnight were built over decades. Collapses that seemed sudden had been cracking for years. A year is a breath. A year is the time it takes for a single season to complete itself and begin again. And yet, I am standing at the podium of the first full assembly of the Independent Compact, in a station that did not exist 14 months ago, looking out at the delegates of 17 species, and I can say with complete honesty that I do not know how to hold in my mind everything that has changed in 1 year. I will try, because this is a memoir, and memoirs are supposed to try. The station is called Anchor, which was the name our design team gave it and which the other founding species voted to keep because, as the Vreth delegation put it, it is simple and accurate and those are qualities worth naming a place after. It sits in what used to be the neutral zone between human and Vreth space, which is no longer a contested region because the contested region no longer exists. It is ours now, in the sense that anything is ours, meaning that the species who live and travel and build there have agreed to hold it in common. Anchor is not large, not by council standards. Conclave Prime could swallow it and have room for several more like it. But Anchor is new, and new things do not need to be large to matter. They need to be real. I look at the delegates before I begin speaking. 17 species. 14 months ago, most of them had never been in the same room. Some of them had disputes with each other that predated my species arriving on this galactic stage. The Thuan and the Pulhari had a boundary argument going back 2 centuries. The Shin Splinter delegation, who had formally separated from the main Shin coalition 6 months ago after the coalition declined to leave the council, had concerns about the Dorothy independent bloc that I had spent 4 months personally mediating. None of these things were resolved by magic. None of them were resolved by the simple act of walking away from a table. They were resolved by work. By the kind of slow, patient, frustrating, occasionally infuriating work that involves sitting across from someone you do not entirely trust and finding, clause by clause and session by session, the terms on which you can both live. Humans are, in my considered opinion, genuinely good at this. Not because we are patient by nature, because we are often not. Not because we are calm, because we are frequently not that either. But because we contain, somewhere in the part of ourselves that developed over long, difficult centuries of trying to share a small planet with billions of other humans, a functional tolerance for disagreement. We can be angry at someone and still talk to them. We can believe we are right and still listen. We have a mechanism, imperfect and often noisy, for holding conflict and cooperation in the same hand at the same time. The compact is built on that mechanism. It is its own. Let me tell what the year looked like, because the assembly deserves to know, and because the people who came after us will need to understand how things that seem solid were once uncertain and fragile. In the first 3 months after the ceasefire, the primary work was not diplomatic. It was logistical. Getting Vreth and human forces to stand down from positions they had held for years required a level of coordination that our 2 militaries had never practiced together. There were 4 incidents in those first 3 months. Not combat incidents. Coordination failures, close approaches, a misread signal that sent 2 patrol ships into a standoff for 11 hours before it was resolved. Nobody was hurt. But there were moments, in those first 3 months, when the whole fragile thing could have collapsed. I want to be honest about that. It could have collapsed. It did not collapse because of a quality that I saw in Dren Akar, and that I came to see in the Vreth leadership more broadly, and that I believe was the genuine surprise of this entire year. The quality was not heroism. It was not grand vision or eloquent speechmaking. It was patience under pressure, the willingness to hold a position when every anxious instinct was saying to react, to respond, to match tension with tension. Dren called me during the 11-hour standoff. He was calm in a way that impressed me, because I knew from his voice that he was not naturally calm about it. He was holding himself to a standard he had decided was important. "We will not be the incident that ends this," he said. "Not over a misread signal." "Neither will we," I said. We weren't. In the 4th month, the council triggered a partial economic restriction. Not the full isolation protocol, because the legal injunctions were still working their way through the tribunal and 3 council species had now formally abstained from the sanctions vote, but a partial restriction on technology transfer in certain categories of industrial supply. The restriction was aimed at slowing our shipbuilding and, presumably, demonstrating that the council still held meaningful power over our economic activity. The restriction did slow some things. I will not pretend it did not. There were 2 months where Callisto ran below capacity because certain component supplies were rerouted and we had to find alternatives. Owen Clark, the young engineer I had spoken to at the window, led a team that redesigned 2 critical hull assembly processes to use materials available from Vreth industrial suppliers. He finished the redesign in 9 days. The new process was, his team noted cheerfully in their report, actually more efficient than the old one. The restriction also had an unintended effect. It demonstrated, to every species watching, what the Council's economic leverage actually looked like in practice. It was smaller than it appeared. The Council had spent centuries building the appearance of comprehensive economic control, but comprehensive economic control only works if there are no alternatives. We were building alternatives. So were the Vreth. So, quietly, were 7 other species who had been chafing under Council-administered trade arrangements for longer than humanity had been in space. By month 6, we had our first full trade agreements with the Vreth, the Thuan, and the Polhari. By month 7, the Shen Splinter Group was conducting formal negotiations to join the compact. By month 8, the Council's partial restriction had become largely irrelevant because we had routed around it. I remember the morning the trade flow numbers came back and showed that our economic activity had returned to pre-restriction levels through alternative channels. Arthur Kane brought me the report. He set it on my desk and did not say anything, just waited. I read it twice. Then I said, "Tell Callisto to go back to full capacity." He allowed himself a small smile. Already done. The legal offensive continued throughout this period. 342 injunctions. The Council's tribunal worked through them slowly, as it had to, because the filings were genuine and the legal arguments were sound and there was no procedural way to dismiss them wholesale without ruling against their own charter. Our legal team, which had grown from 8 people to 31, submitted additional filings as new Council actions generated new grounds for challenge. In month 7, the tribunal issued its first ruling. It found in our favor on 49 of the first 60 injunctions reviewed. The ruling cited the founding charter. It cited the same Ithori precedent from 260 years ago that Councillor Vey had mentioned to me. It found that the Council's application of economic coercive measures in the absence of due process was procedurally invalid. The ruling was technically binding only on those 49 specific injunctions. But the logic of the ruling extended, as our legal team had intended it to the remaining 293. The tribunal's own precedent now required consistency. The Council could not uphold 49 rulings and dismiss the others using the same charter it had just cited. This created a situation in the Council that I will describe simply as difficult. 5 of the 9 member species had now either abstained from votes, issued private objections, or made public statements about the need for Council reform. The Ithori, whose founding charter was at the center of every argument, were in the position of having to either defend a legal framework that was ruling against them or acknowledge that the framework was correct and their application of it had not been. Councillor Vey chose to acknowledge. He did it in a speech to the full Council in month 8, a speech that was remarkable for its directness. He said that the Council had been established to protect order and fairness across the galactic community, and that it had, over time, drifted from the second of those purposes in service of the first. He said the legal challenges humanity had brought were not attacks on the Council but applications of its own principles, and that the inability to distinguish between the two was a problem that required addressing. 2 Council species left within a month of that speech. They did not collapse or dissolve or disappear. They simply ceased to be the sole arbiter of galactic order. There is a difference, and I think it is important to acknowledge it. Some things that lose their singular authority do not become useless. They become one voice among many. Whether the Council becomes that, a voice that contributes rather than controls, is something that will be decided over the years to come, not by me, not in this speech. 3 months ago, Councillor Vey formally requested membership in the Independent Compact on behalf of the Ithori people. Not the Council. The Ithori people. The species, not the institution. I want to be clear about why that distinction matters. What Vey was saying, in that request, was that the Ithori chose to participate in the new structure as members, with a single vote, no seniority, no special authority, no permanent chair. They were choosing to be equal participants in something they had not built and could not control. For a species that had governed the galactic order for 8 centuries, that was not a small thing to choose. We welcomed them. I welcomed Vey personally, because I had been asked to and because it was the right thing to do, and also because I had come to have a genuine, if complicated, respect for him. He is not the villain of this story. I want to say that clearly. He was a person who operated inside a system that had worked in a particular way for a very long time, and who did not question it until someone else gave him reason to. There is nothing especially unusual about that. Most people are that. The question is what you do when the questioning starts. He chose, in the end, to answer honestly. Now I stand at this podium, in Anchor Station, and I look at 17 delegations, and I need to say the things that are hard to say at a moment that wants to feel entirely triumphant. 40,212. That is the number of people, human people, who did not come home from the 11 years of war with the Vreth Dominion. That number does not include the Vreth who died, which was larger than ours by a significant margin, and which represents an accounting that I believe we owe to the families of a species that was, like us, fighting a war it had been guided into rather than chosen. I could read 40,212 names. We would be here for days. I am going to read 3, because 3 is what a moment like this can hold, and because the 3 I have chosen stand for all the others. Lieutenant Commander Paul Reeves, UEC, who held the line at Cydonia Station for 19 days with a crew of 80 against a Vreth fleet that outnumbered him 20-1, and who got 67 of his 80 crew members home, and who did not come home himself. Corporal Ada Ewan, UEC Ground Forces, who was 19 years old, who was from a city called Bristol, who had been in service for 8 months when she died, and who I never met but whose name appeared in a casualty report I read on a morning when the ceasefire was still very fragile, and whose name I have carried with me since. Flight Commander Noah Hartley, who flew 63 combat missions, who survived all of them, who came home, and who died 3 months after the ceasefire from injuries sustained in her final sortie, on a date that fell after the official end of hostilities, and whose name is therefore not on the official memorial. It should be. It will be. I am entering it into the record of this assembly today. I need to say what comes after grief, because speeches about sacrifice can become a way of stopping at the hard part without continuing to the harder part. What comes after grief is the obligation to make the thing worth the cost. Not to say it was worth it, because that is a calculation no one has the right to make on behalf of the people who paid it. But to make what we build from here worthy of the people who made it possible. 17 species in this room. That is 17 languages, 17 histories, 17 different ways of understanding time and territory and what fairness means. We are going to disagree. We are going to disagree in ways that feel serious and important, because they will be serious and important, because the things we are deciding matter. We are going to have procedural arguments and boundary disputes and trade negotiations that go on for months and sessions that end without resolution and all the ordinary, necessary friction of governing something real. This is not a failure state. This is the work. I want to say something to the newer members of the Compact specifically, the species who joined in the last 4 months, who were not part of the founding moment and who are sometimes uncertain, as I understand it, about whether they belong here as fully as the founding members. You belong here as fully as anyone. There are no founding members in the sense of senior members. There is no hierarchy of arrival. We did not build this to become the next version of what we left. The whole point, the actual point, the point I walked out of a room for and that Dren Akkar staked his career and his fleet on and that Paul Adler built 7 months of trade negotiations toward, was that the table should have no head. Every door in this station opens from the inside. I had a conversation, in the 2nd month after the ceasefire, with Dren Akkar, when things were still uncertain enough that neither of us was sleeping well. We were talking about what we were trying to build, whether it was realistic, whether we were being naive about what species in proximity actually do to each other over long time scales. He told me about a Vreth tradition. On the Vreth homeworld, when 2 families who have been in dispute decide to resolve it, they do not sign a document. They build something together. Something physical. It can be small, a wall, a garden structure, a covered walkway. The tradition holds that what you build together, you are less likely to destroy. The act of building creates an investment that pure agreement does not. What would you build? I asked him. He thought for a moment. A station, he said. Somewhere between your space and mine. Somewhere neither of us owns. I looked around this station, the station we named Anchor, built by human and Vreth engineers in 3 months of intense, often confused, occasionally spectacular collaborative effort, and I thought about the conversation. Here is the last thing I want to say before I formally open this assembly. The Galactic Council exists. It is smaller than it was. It is more accountable than it was. Its legal tribunal is working through the remainder of our injunctions, and the rulings continue to favor procedural fairness, and the Council is adapting, slowly and not always gracefully, to a galactic community that no longer has only one governing voice. We did not destroy it. We did not try to. What we did was demonstrate that it was not the only option, and that demonstration was enough. Power that insists it has no alternative is fragile the moment an alternative appears. The alternative does not need to be stronger. It only needs to be real. We are real. 17 species, 1 station, no permanent chairs, no senior members, every door opening from the inside. The compact is imperfect and young and will spend most of its early years managing disagreements that older, more established institutions would have smoothed over before they became visible. Good. Visible disagreements are disagreements being addressed. Smoothed over disagreements are disagreements accumulating. I am going to stop speaking now, because there are 17 delegations who have things to say and this podium belongs to all of us and I have been standing at it long enough. But before I sit down, I want to say one more thing. A year ago I walked into a room full of species staring at me, waiting to see what I would do. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and said 6 words that I was not entirely certain, in that moment, were wise or right or anything more than honest. I have had a year to find out. The room we are in today, we built it. And every door in it opens from the inside. That is everything. That is enough.